Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic, the podcast that breaks down the incentives that guide the decisions we make to understand who benefits from the status quo and what's at stake for the future. I'm Matt Haller.
And I'm Chris Michaud.
On this week's show, we'll be looking at The Office. No, not a retrospective on Michael Scott, but instead how we can be incented to collaborate and innovate while managing culture and mentorship in a world where The Office is no longer entirely a 5 days a week domain. But before we get started, Chris, can you tell me a little bit about your experience going to The Office and how that's changed over the course of your career?
Early on in my career, 5 days a week was just the norm. I remember literally driving an hour to work each day. That's just how it worked. More recently, consulting prior to the pandemic, we traveled 4 days a week. So we were at clients. So we were always on the road. And then the fifth day, we would be in the office. Now it's a bit more of a hybrid approach. And I think that's a trend that pretty much every survey says is not going to go anywhere anytime soon. How about you?
I started my career going to the office 5 days a week. That was the norm. But only a few years in, I became a fully remote employee. I've been doing this since 2018. And I definitely noticed some shifts in how you need to work with people when you work remotely versus when you're face-to-face. There's a lot of challenges that do come with the added flexibility that you get when you work remotely. But Chris, can you give us a little bit of background on how this idea of The Office got its start?
Yeah, so we actually have to go back all the way to Roman times, where the government officials worked in administrative buildings that were called officia. So if we think about the word official and working in an official place, that's where it was derived from. However, the modern office, as we know it today, really began to take shape during the Middle Ages. So in the 1600s, bureaucratic systems in government and commerce really began to evolve. And the East India Company was founded in 1600, and that's really largely considered the first working corporate structure as we know it today, albeit they were an agent of the British government. An interesting story about them, if you go back and read about their history, if you think modern companies are ruthless now, these guys were like kittens compared to how we operate today. So it's a fascinating company. But really, when we pivot more towards the Industrial Revolution, so the 18th and the 19th century, really marked that pivotal shift in work culture where we had factories and mass production became the norm. So alongside this industrial expansion, as we were continuing to make things, a new class of workers evolved. And these became what we know today as, quote, white collar workers who perform these administrative, managerial, and clerical tasks. And offices became essential hubs for organizing this paperwork, managing finances, and coordinating modern business operations as we know it today. If you pivot more towards the 20th century, this is where the efficiency and productivity came into play. A guy by the name of Taylor, you've probably heard of Taylorism, all the things around time and motion studies, how do you standardize processes, Henry Ford with the assembly line, all that stuff evolved into what we have in terms of hierarchical management structures. This era, though, was really rigid, like bureaucratic systems, the division of labor, how office culture was shaped. I mean, really, the focus was around specialization, efficiency, hierarchy. Creativity was not a thing. And also at this time, skyscrapers came along. So cities, you could put more people in central business districts, and that really evolved probably the most dreaded word of all time, cubicle. So millions were made miserable by the advent of skyscrapers in this type of environment. If we go a little bit forward into the Mad Men era, so we'll call it 50s and 60s, we had an unprecedented economic prosperity. We've covered that in other podcasts. But the cultural icons, the office was the epitome, right? So conformity, loyalty, rigid authority. I think the joke was that IBM blue was an actual suit color. So this sort of status quo went on probably for 30 or 40 years. I even remember joining the workforce in the early 2000s, and I still had to wear a suit and tie, and women had to wear dresses. Could you imagine if I told my female staff that today? I'd be sued and canceled. But the one thing that was pretty profound during the 80s and 90s was the advent of PCs, email, Excel, all that stuff, as you alluded to, Matt, earlier, made us more mobile and accessible. So the shift in productivity moved away from going to the office and more into decentralized, flexible structures. So as we've become more autonomous, and I think it's just an emphasis on that flexibility, collaboration, and work-life balance, millennials and Gen Z have challenged these traditional office norms, which in many ways is a good thing, but also seeking environments that really prioritize that autonomy, creativity, and what is a meaningful work experience. The rise of these co-working spaces, remote work, and digital nomadism, I think really reflects a growing desire for flexibility and mobility in the modern workforce.
I think that if we try to trace some of those trends in the way that we organize work, like what the work actually was back in your early example of the East India Company, there weren't a whole lot of people doing what you're referring to as white collar work because the work was actually doing the thing. And so as companies started to get bigger, as we started to have new technologies, and it creates this new class of workers where the work is organizing how work gets done, defining the processes and making sure that the business can run efficiently. It seems as though we've created an environment to support the way that work gets done. So we need these people to be together, because those days, literally pushing paper from one person to another, from one floor to another.
Well, another thing too, to that point, right? Remember, literacy was pretty low in the Middle Ages. So someone who could read and write, the making didn't necessarily need to know that, but the administration of it didn't really allow for a lot of people to be able to do it. So that specialized skill set was probably pretty rare and nuanced in those days.
Yeah, I mean, fast forward to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. As literacy goes up and you start having people have more access to college, and that the job that people are doing starts to look more like I was describing, pushing paper literally from person to person up and down floors, as we love to show in office space, that changes the physical space, the need for where you put those people. You're not going to put those people in the factory because they're going to get in the way. You're going to put them in a room that's dedicated for the work that they're doing and given the tools they need to do their job. But as we progress as a society and those tools change and the internet allows us to access the tools that we need from anywhere, I think the core question is what changes and what's the incentive to go back to that other model of pull you back into the office today. We've seen companies try to pull their employees back. We've seen a backlash against that, but based on who has the power in this situation, where are things going to net out? Where do we think is the idea of returning to the office is going to go in the future?
Well, employment remains relatively robust. We just saw recent unemployment numbers are still low, right? So the job market is remaining strong, stronger than anyone thought. So there's going to be two ways you're going to resolve that problem in terms of kind of office. Either one, AI will come along and probably automate some of the low value add tasks that, and I don't mean that by getting rid of people per se, but more the you and I and others would have more time to focus on the things that matter. So kind of that will, again, you don't need to go into the office to do that. The second part though, to your point around where is there an incentive for an office? I think it's twofold. One, the reality is you need that apprenticeship and experience with people who know how to do it. So the incentive for someone, let's say on the other end where I'm sitting towards the later end of my career, to be able to sit and say, okay, how do I train folks where they feel confident and be able to lead and drive? And I think we haven't figured that out yet. And I think there is a noticeable difference of folks who join the workforce in the last 4 or 5 years, that soft skills, being able to work together and build something out and feeling like they are confident in it is lacking. It's what it is. And we need to figure out a way to make it work.
I'm hoping that our guests are going to help us understand a little bit more. I'm really excited about the guest that we have today because we're going to try to triangulate a perspective on not necessarily what's better, but more, can we understand what are the prerequisites to making each one of those models work and be effective? And in the age of AI, to your point, in the age of inflation and companies trying to save money, what's the incentive to use one model versus another? And who really stands to gain from that reality of going back into the office? Well, with that, Chris, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk to Christina Anastos, a sales manager at Shopify. Stay with us.
Calling all B2B sales executives. Ready to elevate your sales game? Meet Compose Comp, your partner in sales incentive excellence. Our tailored solutions blend expert design with tech innovation, ensuring your reps have the confidence to close deals. Take the first step to sales success. Visit composecomp.com and schedule your consultation now.
Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic. Our first guest is Christina Anastos, a sales manager at Shopify. Christina has a sales and business development background and has been managing remote sales teams since 2020. Welcome to the show, Christina.
Thank you for having me.
So your team today is fully remote. Was your team always this way, or did the pandemic change those norms?
So I actually have never managed a team in office, which is almost a scary stat, but I took my first BDR manager role 8 months into the pandemic and spent about 2 years managing BDR teams in a completely remote environment. That company has since now gone back to office mostly, but I actually made a switch to Shopify at that time, which is like very remote first. So every team that I've ever managed at Shopify has been fully remote.
What do you think are some of the keys to managing just remote employees in general, but then also specifically BDR population that you work with?
Yeah, so I would say like BDR population is a little bit different. So at my previous company, I was managing BDRs. Now at Shopify, I manage AEs. I would say managing BDRs in the pandemic was a very interesting time. I think keys for both levels I've found in remote work, we have to be very specific about expectation setting. I would tell you that I never thought that I would be a manager who would have something like a working with me doc, right? This is how I manage, this is what I give to new employees. That just like feels so anti-me as a person, to be honest with you. But I found it's just like such a necessity because the majority of the interaction that you have with these folks is completely remote for maybe the first 6 months, right? Sometimes you end up meeting them in person. We try and do like intentional team kind of meetings twice a year. But I would say you got to be very intentional with expectation setting. So that way, you can almost like really point to when things aren't going well.
Do you think that was compounded by the fact that they had gone through the pandemic of being remote at university and then hired into the workplace remote? I would imagine that was super challenging because they've never interacted with a team of fellow BDRs and AEs in a work environment.
I think so. I think even like thinking about my own experience, being in sales now remotely is wonderful, right? I hope I never go back to an office. But I also, for me, I spent 2 to 3 years in an office, like in office 5 days a week. And I think that there's a lot of like social professionalism elements of the job that you pick up in person that I think this generation of folks who have been in college remotely and then in their first jobs remotely and now maybe in their second job remotely, they pick them up. They just pick them up, I think, a little bit slower.
Yeah, it's almost like you don't have the same level of exposure. Like I remember my first consulting job, like a third of me picking up professional skills, learning how to talk to clients, wasn't actually coming from my first client interactions. That's not a great place to practice. It's from watching the senior associates, the managers, the directors, the partners, having their own interactions, each one a little bit differently, and you pick up a little bit of osmosis along the way. It sounds like when you're working with a remote team, there's fewer of those osmosis opportunities. So it just takes a lot longer and potentially more cultural friction right off the bat.
Yeah, there's no sales floor, right? There's no listening to calls. I remember being a BDR on a floor of 100 people. And when you're not on a call, you're listening to the person next to you, the person in the road in front of you. And yeah, to your point, Matt, there's just a lot of osmosis that happens every day, whether you're having a busy day or not, that I think it just takes a lot longer to learn those things in a remote environment.
How do you maintain employee morale and like just engagement, given that folks are remote?
I think it's hard. Like I said, I'm really spoiled right now because we do 2 in-person meetups per year in which you get together for 3 to 4 days. The last one that I attended was 100 people. So it's like everyone that works in our org, supports our org. My whole team was there. I think it's important from like an empathy perspective as well to just get together with your coworkers and remember everyone's a human. Everyone has things going on in their lives. Share a meal, be a little bit more casual with them and kind of build that bond. But I would say like I've done like everything to do morale. Like we've done like virtual paint nights. We've done like virtual pottery classes, right? Like you name it. I've probably been a part of it virtually at this point, but I do think it's difficult. I think like the funny thing is like now I would say I probably carve more time out for my team to do non-work things as a morale boosting mechanism. So we'll have just an hour on our calendar that's just like, hey, let's all jump in and talk about what we're doing for the weekend. If you want to come, if you don't want to come, no big deal, no pressure. It's like scheduled social time, which feels so odd, but I think it matters.
Do you think that part of that just becomes the role of a manager in the remote world? Being a manager is not about doing the work. It's about controlling and managing how the work gets done, setting those standards and processes so that the customer has a consistent experience.
I think there's like a couple different strategies for solving it, right? I think for me, while there's, hey, we have to keep morale high and we have to make sure that they're engaged and we have to have a pulse on what's going on, I would say like my default in order to get that done with my team is just like over communicate. And like I am the most available human being at all times. I do think that in a remote world, that's where things get a little bit more difficult is like in the gray area, what are people doing? Because there's not really like anyone watching what's happening, right? Or you have a little bit more autonomy and a little bit more freedom. So I think the mechanism for me to do that is just like, hey, I'm always here. Let me know what's happening and over communicate throughout the day. It could be the smallest detail of a deal. I'd rather know it than not know it.
Companies are making a shift back to hybrid work, even pulling people all the way back into the office. What have you seen is the advantage of managing a remote team as some of, I imagine, your competitors are starting to go back into the office?
For background, like as a BDR, I was someone who was like, I don't want to be in an office 5 days a week. I want to go make cold calls in a room somewhere. And yeah, I want to be on a sales floor for osmosis, which is super important, but this isn't an 8 or 9 hour a day work schedule. Like I can do most of my work in 2 to 3 hours a day if I put my head down, don't have any distractions. And then you like send follow-ups and listen to other people. So I think because of that, I've always believed that that employees do better when they have the ability to have a little bit more autonomy. And I think for me, I think it's a competitive advantage, as silly as it sounds, for someone to be able to like jump off a meeting and then go work out and then get back to their laptop 45 minutes later, right? When we're in office, like that doesn't happen. There's no, let me just leave my desk and go work out downstairs and then come back. It turns into a 2-hour ordeal. And like getting lunch is a thing in office that I feel like always took way longer, right? You're like walking, you're standing in line somewhere, you're getting your sweet green, you're like coming back, you're socializing for 45 minutes with your coworker. Now it's like someone walks to the fridge, gets a yogurt, they eat their yogurt, they're back in 15 minutes. And that's not to say like everyone needs to be overworked, right? But I think there's these little things that allow you to be productive outside of work as well in your personal life throughout the day that I actually think does boost morale. And I think actually like makes you feel productive, right? I always think about it as like sales days can be awful. You can spend a day calling people and get no responses and you feel terrible, but being able to like get up from your desk, walk over and do your laundry and feel like you checked something off the list that you like were going to have to do after work hours, then you come back and maybe you feel a little bit refreshed. I think those little things actually go a long way.
To your point, the new launch is essentially a workout, right? So like figure out ways to make that time more effective. What's the incentive to drive your other folks who are remote to that same attitude?
I think the hiring profile gets really tight, to be honest, or at least like in my experience, that's what I've seen. I think like truly there are people that maybe do better work in an office. And I think it takes a lot of like self-awareness as well in the people that are like applying for remote jobs to understand like I'm doing this or I'm seeking this type of job because I think that I do better work or equally as good work in this environment versus being in person. I think like we really overscreen for self-awareness and like motor and grit because I think you just have to, right? Because without it, I do think you run the risk of someone who isn't necessarily going to enjoy sitting on their laptop in a more lonely environment.
Christina, thank you very much for stopping by and sharing some of your insights on how to do remote work and make that work well. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk with Teresa Kennedy, a sales planning manager who has been working hybrid over the last couple of years. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic. Our second guest is Teresa Kennedy, a senior sales strategy manager at Intercom who has switched from being fully remote to being in office in a hybrid capacity. Welcome to the pod, Teresa.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be here.
So before we get into all the pros and cons of the hybrid role, I want to talk about your experience going from working fully remotely to being in a hybrid capacity. What are some of the big trends or differences in your experiences, either good, bad, or otherwise?
So I had a kind of interesting setup where I was actually starting this job working in Michigan where I did my MBA. And then I moved to San Francisco and we slowly along that same timeline became more and more in office to now we're in there 2 days a week. And it's pretty mandatory versus at first it was more of an optional if you want to come in situation. So I think there's a couple trade-offs. I think for me personally, my kind of hard work is a little bit easier to do at home. I work with some confidential data. Working in sales strategy, you work on comp design changes, headcount changes, quota setting, all of that kind of stuff, which isn't necessarily something you want salespeople to see on your screen. So I think there's a little bit more ease for myself being at home. I think the flip side of that is in terms of our team culture, I've seen it really change dramatically. When I first started, you only knew 1 or 2 bullet points about everyone on the team. And now I feel like I have great stories about my coworkers and just more of a relationship so that when I'm asking people to help pull data for me, it's not just Teresa Kennedy on Slack asking you.
Did you find that folks became, in addition to being more social, like more productive, or do you think the productivity has been about the same in being fully remote versus the hybrid approach?
I think it depends on the folks. So I would say I'm fairly senior in that I've done a similar role. So I'm pretty independent. Whereas some people on my team who are a little bit more junior, I feel like are more productive in the office because it's just so much easier to ask a question to the person sitting next to you. And last week, one of my coworkers, her manager was out. So I became her de facto manager for the day of, hey, what do you think? Should it be formatted like this? Should I make this graph like this? Do you know how to change this in Excel? And I can just really easily jump in. Whereas on Slack, it's so much more awkward to write that and say, hey, I'm trying to decide if I should write percentage points in this format or this format. What do you think? It's just a really easy conversation. So I think it's allowed me to take on more mentoring and helping other people on the team. But I think I don't see personally that much of a productivity benefit. And I guess it also depends on the job, right? My job is not highly collaborative. It's not really highly creative in any way. I think if I was in marketing or maybe even doing coding, it might be a little bit different because I might want more collaboration.
As companies are grappling with the decision both to bring workers back to the office, but also how best to do that, have you seen a certain schedule work well? Some companies will say everybody needs to come in on certain days. And what have you seen works really well from that perspective?
We have a set schedule that it is Tuesday and Thursday for sales. If you can't make it, you can come in on a Wednesday or a Monday or Friday if you really want to or need to. I find that having a set schedule is really important. So it is not worth it for me to go in the office and interface with one person on my team. It is worth it when everyone on the team is there and we all collaborate, we all have lunch together. I find a lot of value from that. So I think that's been one thing that Intercom has done really well, or I guess Intercom sales is our VP of sales has said Tuesdays and Thursdays are our days. This is when you're going to come in and we're going to collaborate. I think that's really helpful. Personally, I love having a day break in the middle between Tuesdays and Thursdays. I don't know. We used to go in the office 5 days a week. I know I did. But anymore, I go in the office on Tuesday. And even sometimes when I think, I got to come in on Wednesday, like I'd rather just be working from home the next day. So I think having a little bit of a break is really nice. I love our 2 days, Tuesday and Thursday in the office. I think it's really optimal.
Do you think that sort of establishing that set schedule, to your point, drives more collaboration in the office? But also if I think about some of the benefits we've gotten from remote work, like more women entering the workforce, being able to manage caregiver duties, by having that defined schedule, does that allow your teams to be able to manage those types of life situations while still being present?
Yes. So my manager has 3 kids. I think they're all under the age of 8 or 9 at home, and he lives down in Mountain View. So he has to commute into the office. So for him, he blocks off who's going to take care of childcare and dropping his kids off in the morning. What time is he going to commute in? He puts that on his calendar and can really plan around it. Whereas I think not having that set schedule, it would be a little bit more taxing to decide every single week. When you're at a director level or a VP level, obviously you have a lot of meetings. So your schedule is taken over by other people if you're not proactively blocking it off. And our company was started in Europe. So we have a lot of folks still in the Dublin office, and we call 8 to 10 a.m. as golden hours, where you really collaborate across the different locations from San Francisco to Dublin. And so a lot of the time he commutes in after that and just comes in a little bit later, or he'll commute in kind of earlier depending on the traffic. So I think it allows him a little bit more of a schedule to stick to. And it's very clear for me when I'm scheduling with my manager, this is his commute time. It's a Thursday, so he's going to stay in the office late. On a Tuesday, he leaves the office early. It's just very clear.
So I think what we've heard a little bit is that the idea of returning to office can sound really rigid because I'm going to drag you back into the office. But there's a recognition that, number one, there's a kind of work that maybe that's better to be collaborative, or that we'll learn better if we're in a group. But maybe there's some things that having that flexibility to deal with people's personal schedules is okay too. It's not so much as you need to be in the office from 8:12 in the morning until 4:58 in the evening. We're not going back to the office space days, but it is a recognition that while we spent a few years trying to prioritize staying away from each other, we need to work on trying to prioritize that in-person connection where appropriate to make sure that our teams can work together really well.
Yeah. And I think in addition to the overall work that's getting done, I think there's also a really big piece around the team culture. And that's something we saw. So at Intercom, we have this idea of inner cards. So basically for your first year anniversary working at the company and your third and fifth, every other year, you get kind of a playing card made of yourself. And it's a really cool tradition that has come up through the history of the company. And in order to do that, your peers have to submit what's the idea for your background? What are we going to write about you? And then 3 little icons that go in the corner, like a little playing card or like a Pokemon card. And so when we first started doing that, it was pretty bleak. It was a lot of Slack messages of, what do you know about Eddie? Eddie has 3 kids. Eddie is from Israel. I think Eddie might like soccer. Does Eddie like soccer? It was very awkward, and generic cards come from that. Now that we have more of this in-office culture and we're actually seeing each other, we have way deeper stories. It's way easier to put something like that together, which sounds like you should be able to get those little snippets at the end of your Zoom meetings, but it just doesn't happen, right? No one's willing to sit on a Zoom call and be like, oh, and how's life? How was your weekend? We just want to get it done and move on to the next thing.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. It was really interesting to understand that perspective of how you've migrated from a remote environment to a hybrid environment. And it sounds like it's been a success. We're going to take a break and then come back and talk about our predictions for the future. Stay with us.
Hey B2B sales pros, want to maximize your team's performance? Discover Compose Comp, your key to optimize sales incentives. We blend expertise and technology to give your reps the edge they need to close deals. Don't settle for ordinary. Visit composecomp.com and unlock your team's full potential today.
Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic. It's time for some predictions. Chris, what do we think about what we've heard from our guests about the future of return to office?
I heard definitely 2 distinct things. One, the 5-day-a-week office is dead. The idea of even coming back to that is pretty much non-existent. But what I also heard on the positive side is that both fully remote and hybrid teams can be incredibly productive when managed and focused appropriately.
Yeah. If I reflect on my experience being in the office, both managing a team in the office and also being managed in an office, there's more flexibility up the management chain because you are literally looking at the people that you're working with every day. So there's almost more of a margin of error where you can help shape people's behaviors, shape them culturally, ingratiate them into the way that you want to work. That's a lot harder to do on a remote and hybrid team. But I think to me, the big takeaway was the role of managers is going to have to change in the future because you're going to have to facilitate both the way that work gets done, but also the social interactions and the emotional capacity of your team. And that's something that managers have always had, but it looks like we heard from Christina, way different in this world.
I agree with you 100%. It requires very deliberate and more hands-on, not hands-on in a micromanaging way, but more hands-on in understanding the EQ and understanding what folks need to be successful.
Yeah, I think in both cases, it's about being intentional about the way that you are facilitating your team's interactions. If you're going to work remotely, having that document that says, here's our team norms, and being extremely specific and clear about what those norms are going to be and what the expectations are. And then doing something similar, again, because you're a hybrid, you can be a little bit more flexible with this, but making at least some broad guidelines that say, we're going to try to be in the office together on these days because that's going to allow us the best chance for the interaction that will help our business be successful. But again, intentionality is key.
Yeah, there's a little bit of both the carrot and the stick in the sense that the carrot should be, okay, we're not going to go back to 100% in office. But the stick of that being, hey, these are the 2 days I expect you to be in, and it's really not optional unless obviously there's some sort of extenuating circumstance. And I think that deliberation and that sort of active consciousness of being in, I think will help then make people feel, again, the incentive to go into the office, more productive and engaged. And there's companies who've actually tried doing this in other ways too, like there are work weeks, right? So Smucker's does this. There's like 18 weeks a year that everybody is in the office, and the other 26 weeks a year, I did do the math right on that, but you get the idea. Thank God I don't have a finance degree. Oh, wait, I do. The other remaining part of the year, you can be wherever you want. So again, I think that deliberate, you've hit on it, and I'm beating it to death, but the conscious and deliberate tact to do that, I think is what will make this successful in the long run.
I would say that companies that are smaller can't afford the same kinds of benefits that a really large multinational employer might be able to give their own employees, are going to use remote work as a competitive advantage to try to attract the talent that otherwise either is unwilling or unable to work in a hybrid or more in person. But I think that if you have a company that has a lot of real estate space, they might be downsizing it to de-risk it off their books, but they are absolutely going to pull you back into the office because they're already paying for that space. So if I'm going to pay you a lot of money and I already have a lot of this real estate space, then there isn't much of an incentive for me to not pull you back into the office in some capacity. And that's what I really think the way that this future of return to office is going to shake out.
The incentive, again, at the end of the day will be, do I want to make lease payments or do I want to retrain people which is very expensive, especially if you have specialized skills that say, I'm not going to do that. I will go somewhere else.
Like I said, the key is if you're going to go remote, you can do it. It can work. It can be a wonderful competitive advantage, but you need to have a strategy. It's not as simple as just shipping a laptop to someone's house and saying, show up on Monday at 9 a.m.
Two consultants saying there needs to be a strategy. That's definitely something that's never been done before.
Shocking. Don't ask me for what the strategy is, but there should be one.
And you know what? I think that's a great place to leave it. So thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of Fuzzy Logic. Fuzzy Logic is produced by Mitch Rissmiller. New episodes drop on Wednesdays wherever you get your podcasts. See you next week.